Yeah, so what is resilience is actually a very interesting question. So it's essentially bouncing back. Once you face a shock, you don't block off the shock, but you bounce back. And I think probably the best way to explain resilience is to contrast it with other concepts like robustness or avoiding risk or sustainability. And perhaps I can say a little bit about, how is it different from robustness? If you're very robust, it means you were hit by a shock and you don't move at all. You just can block off the shock. Resilience means you're hit by a shock, you really face the shock, but then you are agile and modify your response such that you can bounce back much more quickly. And one way to contrast this is you go back to a 17th century French writer, La Fontaine, who compared the oak and the reed. So the oak is like very rigid and very strong, and when the wind comes, it doesn't move much, so it's very robust. But the reed is constantly going back and forth, but when it's hit, it will bounce back. So the reed is much more resilient, while the oak is much more robust. But there's a big difference between the two. One is if you are robust, you might have a robustness barrier or a tipping point. If there's a hurricane, the oak falls over and then doesn't come back, while the reed is always bouncing back. And actually in the story by La Fontaine, there's a fable and they talk to each other. And then the reed talks to the oak. I bend, I bow, but I do not break. So that's, I think, the big difference. And there's some concept which I worked on earlier, which is this volatility paradox, which seems something which is very volatile and constantly moving around seems much weaker than something which is very rigid and stable and doesn't move much. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, the reed, even though it seems very volatile and weak, seems much more resilient or much more stable ultimately. And that's what I think a society should be. It should not be very rigid. It should actually allow for people to think differently and move and adjust. It seems weak, but then you bounce back much more quickly, and I think that's one of the big differences.
So is resilient then better than robustness, or is that too simple to say?
It depends. So it depends what risks you face. So if you have resilience, it's typically cheaper to have resilience, because if you want a robust system or robust society, for each shock you need a lot of redundancies. So it might be even impossible. Think of a skyscraper. If you want to make sure that it is very rigid, it doesn't move in the wind at all, you probably have to put so much resources on it that the skyscraper cannot stand anymore. While a resilient, where the skyscraper moves around in the wind and always bounces back, you may need much fewer resources. So the big difference is, instead of having for each type of shock a redundancy or some extra reserve units or whatever you need fewer, but you need more flexible reserve units which you can move around. So it's cheaper in a sense and the whole system becomes more stable for many more shocks compared to a robust system. And I would say it's better, but of course it depends on the eye of the beholder. If somebody doesn't want to move at all and doesn't want to be agile and flexible at all, well, then people might prefer robust